Good morning, everyone. My name is Calvin Conlip. I'm the president of the board of the Friends of the Library at Bethel University, and I want to welcome you all to Primetime in the Bethel University Library. So, welcome. Primetime is a collaborative project between Friends of the Bethel University Library, faculty and staff, as well as students and many other offices on campus which celebrate learning outside of the classroom. And also one to celebrate people's experiences and accomplishments, especially those Bethel faculty, students, and staff members. You can find a schedule of all of our upcoming Primetime events on the Bethel University website, or the library website. And now we would like to present the Library Research Prize Award. The purpose of the Library Research Prize is to promote undergraduate research throughout curriculum, all of their curriculum and their classes, and also to encourage excellence in student research that makes substantial use of the library resources and also demonstrates understanding of information and literacy competencies. So big words meaning that we look for excellence. The winner of the 2016 Library Research Prize is Emma Beecken. Emma is now going to share with us about her paper and the research process that was necessary for her essay that she submitted, and the paper is titled Hannah More's Moral Imagination, Fiction and Reformed, Fiction That Reformed a Nation. So Emma, come on up.
Thank you. My name is David Stewart. I'm the director of the library, and it's a great honor to be able to present the 2016 Library Research Prize to Emma Beecken for her outstanding work. Erlene, how many applicants do we have this year? Okay, so it's competitive, and one of the most encouraging parts of my job, my office is right over there, is seeing heavy traffic in and out of the library and people making good use of our resources. And what Emma has done has been to exemplify that. So we're very proud of her and look forward to her presentation this morning. Congratulations, Emma.
All right, pull it up here quick. Well, I have the absolute privilege today of getting to tell you about Hannah More. Hannah More and I spent the summer together. I researched Hannah More over the course of the entire summer as part of my senior seminar process for the history department, and it was a huge blessing. It was also a huge time commitment that I'm very glad that I made, but it was kind of leaking into the other aspects of my life. I was also nannying this summer, and at the end of the summer one day, I hear the 4-year-old wandering around singing, Hannah More, Hannah More, Hannah More. Well, I guess this had an impact of some sort. So Hannah More is an amazing and fantastic person, in my opinion, and I so enjoyed getting to know her. But the first question that I'm sure is on a lot of people's minds is, who was she? Because, like I said, I talked to about everyone I met this summer about Hannah More, and only one person had heard of Hannah More, ever. And I really didn't know who she was before this project either. So before I even get into my process, I just want to give you a brief background that can help understand why she was so awesome. So first, she was born in England in 1745 until 1833. She spanned the lives of 3 kings. She lived a very ripe life. She died at the age of 88, very impressive for the time. And she did a lot in those 88 years. Just for starters, she was an author. This is primarily what she's remembered for, but she should be remembered for because it's what she was known for at the time. She wrote poetry, she wrote novels, she wrote essays, she wrote propaganda, she wrote everything, basically. And it was very, very, very popular. She was also a philanthropist. She was widely known for her work with the slums, and particularly in the Cheddar neighborhood. She started Sunday schools, we'll talk a little bit about that, for the poorest of poor. She had huge charity dinners that made all the newspapers, that served hundreds of people. She just did a lot with the poorest of the poor in her community. She was also a staunch abolitionist. She's made her mark on history for abolition, and I'll get to talk about that a little more. She was also just in general a reformer. She was looking for England to change, and that's why she did all these other things. So Hannah More's legacy, more or less, is that of someone who, for the sake of the glory of Christ, was attempting to reform society. So just a few highlights here. Before she even began that, she was extremely popular and extremely successful. As a very young woman, like the age of 19 or so, she wrote her first play. And she'd written it actually for the girls who attended the school that she helped teach and found at the age of 19. And then from there, it really snowballed. She wrote a bunch of plays that were super popular, and she became good friends with the literati. I always say it, and it sounds like Illuminati. But literati. And she was a member of the Blue Stockings, more or less, which was like this really elite group of female authors who were very well known and just respected in the community. So that by 1779, when Samuel Richer drew this or made this painting of the 9 living muses that he selected as the most fundamental women in the cultural world at that time in England, she was one of them, hence the red circle. She was incredibly important and recognized for that because of her skill and her talent as a playwright. And then her life changed. In 1779, so when she was in her mid-30s, she read John Newton's Cardiphonia, and she experienced an evangelical conversion. She had been a Christian, a cultural Christian. She'd been a moralist. She'd been writing plays to help people, and she purposely was doing things to make society better and be more Christian. But then she realized that there was more to it than just acting Christian, than just trying to be a good person. And after reading Newton's Cardiphonia, Newton as in the guy who wrote Amazing Grace, the guy whose lots of movies have been made about, pretty cool guy, she also became connected with this idea that there was more to do with the world than just being a cultural Christian. She wanted to go deeper and use her talents for the glory of God. This is when she joined forces with William Wilberforce, which is awesome, because William Wilberforce is also awesome. I may plan to name one of my children after him. He's getting to be more and more well known as someone who was the #1 fight for abolitionist guy in England at the time. Very important member of Parliament. And Wilberforce and Hannah More were like super close, like best buds. She was 14 years older than he, so it was kind of a big sister relationship. He would write her letters and be like, hey, should I marry her? And she would write back, no. And then once she said yes, and then he did. And they left each other large sums of money in their wills, except they died 3 weeks after each other, so it didn't actually work out that way. But they were very, very close. Wilberforce describes her as kind of the heart behind the law. He would have this idea, like, let's get rid of slavery. And then Hannah More would agree with him, and then she would go out, write a bunch of poems and a couple of books and some pamphlets, and then everyone would read them and be like, yes, we should abolish slavery. So then when William Wilberforce went to Parliament, he would have much more success. That simplified it greatly. But more or less, she was the one who helped change the hearts so that the laws could be changed, which is just really cool. It's a part of the story that often gets neglected. She has one of my favorite quotes from Hannah More is, I have no doubt it is a part of Christianity to convert every natural talent to a religious use. If you're familiar with Wilberforce at all, you'll know that this is a very similar story, very parallel stories. They both had been successful in their own fields. Wilberforce as a politician, More as an author. Then they both realized, I want to become a Christ follower 100%. Then they said, oh shoot, do I need to give up everything I just did? And then they ultimately came to the conclusion, through the mentoring of Newton, that no, I'm going to use my success, use my power, use my talents to glorify God through that. So this is a very similar story for both of them, and just another reason why Hannah More is just an awesome role model to have. Like I said, she started the Sunday school movement. So this was really important in getting literacy out to the youngest classes. Was it perfect? No, but she was a huge proponent of this. Some of the largest Sunday schools in history were Hannah More's. Abolition. Karen Swallow Prior calls her the single most influential woman in the British abolitionist movement. She wrote poems like Slavery, Sorrows of Yamba, Feast of Freedom, a bunch of other pamphlets, looks like every 10 years or so in there, that she would write these, and then that would help Wilberforce's case as she fought for abolition. This is kind of what she's being remembered as a little more these days. When you hear about Hannah More, you're most likely to hear her in that abolition conversation. So, needless to say, I sat down at the beginning of the summer and realized I had no clue where to start, because I could write about a million papers on just that, because she did a million things. And should I write about literacy, or should I write about Sunday schools, or should I write about evangelicals, or abolition? I mean, where did I even begin? I was a bit overwhelmed. So I started with this awesome book, which I just brought because I love it, Karen Swallow Prior wrote Fierce Convictions, which is the extraordinary life of Hannah More. And it was published in 2014, which in and of itself is extraordinary because nobody writes about Hannah More these days, except for this book. So if I'm looking for a modern book on Hannah More, this was it. So I started by just reading this one through, cover to cover, figuring out what is she highlighting as the most important parts of Hannah More's life. So I took that as my studying base and then turned to the bibliography and went from there to discover some of the most important sources that she had used, some of the primary sources that Karen Swallow Prior had depended on, as well as some of the major secondary sources. So that was my initial skeleton of what I was looking for when I went to actually find secondary sources, which then became a massive undertaking because it may be noted that there are not many books about Hannah More, as I've mentioned, so I couldn't just go upstairs and grab 7, because there aren't even 7. There are books about Hannah More that are old and obscure and no one has anymore, so I really had to depend on WorldCat and ClickNet and get them shipped in from everywhere. I came by and picked up books like every week this summer, large armloads of them, and so I was able to ultimately track down basically every book on Hannah More ever, because there aren't many. And then I had a lot of books. So I then had to figure out what I was going to do with all of these books. So my suggestion, or my thought, with my roommate's exasperation, was to set up a tent in the living room. Had dual purposes, also some babysitting stuff. But primarily, it became my Hannah More tent. So I had all of these piles of dozens of books, where I can't just put them in the living room, so I put them in the tent. And then I had them in piles, and then I had a wad of sticky notes that I would label the piles. Then I would arrange them all differently and put different sticky notes on them. And it was kind of a disaster. But it was also kind of wonderful because it contained the disaster. I spent a lot of time in the tent this summer. My roommate would come home and stick her head in and say, "What did you learn today?" And then I would get to reiterate everything. So that was really how I was dealing with all this information. As I did this, sorting them out, rearranging them, one of the ways I did this was chronologically. When were the books on Hannah More published? And a very clear pattern came through. If you look at the historiography of Hannah More, there were a lot of books published in the years immediately after Hannah More's death. Logically, they liked her and they wanted to talk about her. So we've got Taylor's in 1838, Thompson in 38, Knight in 1851, really important, critical works that highlight some of the main aspects of More's career, have some primary sources, some eyewitness testimonies. Then it got a little quiet for a while, until the 1950s. And in the early 1950s, some new correspondence was found, some new letters and diaries, so more excitement was drawn, a few more pieces were written, including Mary G. Jones' Hannah More of 1952. This I would consider the best complete biography of the era before Prior's book, really. It's just very complete, and so I used this one quite a bit. There was some other books published in like 50 and 51, then they found some more new stuff. But 52 Jones was really important. Then it got quiet again, and I realized that there is a trend here. The next time Hannah More shows up is in the middle of the second wave of feminism. And when I was realizing when these publication dates were coming out, it all made sense. Because no one talked about her for a little while, because she was not a feminist, and so the feminists were not proud of her, and so they weren't talking about her. But then they were like, well, she is a woman. It was kind of the impression I got, so let's bring her up. So then some more books were published. So there was significant silence, and the bubble burst, the aftermath came, more publications on More, but they were really mixed opinions. Some were like, yes, Hannah More is awesome. Others, not so much, because some considered her to be just unforgivably anti-feminist. And this is where my tent had to take a brief hiatus, because it got a little sticky when I found things like, well, my next question was who to believe. So I started finding things like Elizabeth Kowalski Wallace's book, Their Father's Daughters, published in '91, so the aftermath again here. She said, More is like the bad fairy, not invited to participate in the celebration of Sleeping Beauty's birth. And at first I was just thrown off by the Disney comparison. It seemed out of place in the scholarly work. And then I was like, wait, Hannah More is not a bad fairy? And then she went on to continue to say that Hannah More is one of women writers who, like uninvited guests, make the process of celebrating our heritage as women more difficult. And then I got very concerned because I didn't feel that way, and I wanted to understand what she was seeing that I wasn't seeing. So there was such a very vivid break point between the good and the bad. There was a pro-Moore camp and an anti-Moore camp. So I rearranged the books again and took a look at what was going on there. And to help figure out where I stood on this, I had to do more than just reading secondary sources because they were all so different. So my next step was to connect with those primary sources. I actually don't really know why I have this picture. I found it. I apparently was just so excited about my books that I took a picture of them while I was researching this summer. But I did have the opportunity then to read all of the work, well, that's still not quite all because they're really long, a lot of the works of Hannah More, as well as a lot of the contextual work surrounding her, the letters she wrote, the diaries she kept, other books and pamphlets that were written at the time, and just really compare and contrast and figure out, well, is she good or is she bad? And in the course of that, I ultimately came to the conclusion that the people who are anti-Moore, I won't get into this super deep because it's not really the point here, but the people who are anti-Moore were mostly anti-Moore because of, well, in many cases it was because she was a Christian, and because they weren't so thrilled with her biblical Christianity that they weren't a fan of that, so they were not a fan of Hannah More. There were also people who felt that she was so conservative that they didn't like her. Others were concerned about almost patronizing behaviors in her charities, and that is something that, you know, can be considered, and I can see where they would come from with that when you read some of her works. But when you contextualize it and you recognize that she's in the middle, it's the 1770s, guys, the 1790s. There's a lot of things. The fact that she's even trying to make a difference is in and of itself just outstanding. And yes, she might be conservative, she might not be a feminist, but it's the 1790s. So I think that if you actually put it in context, I came out of this very confident and just amazed at what Hannah More had written, what she stood for, and she had to put up with a lot of flack in her time too. But I think that at the end of the day, when I read her sources, I can get behind her, and I can really like her. So that's cool. I also just want to take a brief moment here to address the world's coolest primary source, which I went to the library, picked up my books one day, opened up this book, which I had checked out from WorldCat, and it's Hannah More's, one of my favorite books of Hannah More, Cole Love's In Search of a Wife. We'll get to that later. Her novel. And the actual book was published in like 35, but that had an inscription inside in brown, beautiful ink from 1836 to Miss Abigail something or another, from her affectionate father, read and imitate. So anyway, I just thought that was so cool. As I was sitting there reading this book, imagining Abigail or something, reading the same book as she sent her children off to the Civil War. I don't know, it was just really cool. Just thought I'd give a brief shout out there because that was the coolest book in WorldCat, probably ever. But there were other books that were harder to find. Going back to the primary source conversation, like Memoirs of the Life and Correspondence of Mrs. Hannah More from 1834 is this one. And needless to say, they don't keep that one in Anoka County Library. And so they only have like 2 copies at Oxford, which was unfortunate. And I was very discouraged because I really wanted this book. And then I remembered Google Books, which became my very best friend this summer. I ended up discovering a bunch of different websites that had the full copies of all of the primary sources in the world, basically. I used New York Public Library Digital Collection for Female Guardian, designed to correct some of the foibles incident to girls and entertain them in their hours of leisure. That was a good one. Or archive.org's Anecdotes of Miss Lydia Lively, intended to improve and amuse the upcoming generation. Anyway, that was another fun one. Public Domain Review, Google Books. You may notice the top 3 aren't actually written by Hannah More. They were works that I was using to help contextualize what else was being published at this time when Hannah More was writing. I just thought that was fun, so I highlighted it for a second. We'll move on. But then I was still struck at this point, how am I going to make this my own? I can't just rewrite Fierce Convictions. I can't just write another biography of Hannah More, as cool as she is, and as deserving as she would be of that. So I then had to go back to the tent and figure this all out again. And ultimately, I was asking myself the question, what made Hannah More unique? I figured if I could come up with that, I could make my paper unique. And this is, it took some digging. What made her different from these other authors? She was very, very popular. She was very, very successful. Get to that a little later. But what else was different? And then it struck me. It's like, hey, what's different is that Hannah More is using moral imagination. She's going to use stories to change society. She's writing these lovely, like tracts and pamphlets and just novels that are changing the way people think, and it's so cool. And I was so excited. I had this awesome coin termed moral imagination. It sounded so good. I was telling my sister, and I was like, this is so cool. And she was like, oh, you mean like what everyone does? Like, you know, like Jesus spoke in parables, and like every book ever is moral imagination? I was like, no. I was like, yeah, you're right. So that was a little disheartening as well. Because, yeah, a lot of things are moral imagination. Like if you look at the books written at this time, Miss Lydia Lively, the Foibles book that I've showed previously, they all had very much a purpose of trying to improve people. Even Pamela and Clarissa, the very popular novels of the time, were written really with the intention of making people better. Pilgrim's Progress, another slightly earlier book that this wasn't anything new. So it's like, well, okay, that wasn't it. But I did like the idea of moral imagination, and I wanted to dive deeper because for some reason, her moral imagination was better or more successful or something was different. So I had to go a little bit deeper, and I ultimately came to two conclusions here. She was unique because she was, first of all, an evangelical, and second, she adapted her writing to meet readers' needs. And this is where she differentiates herself from all the other awesome authors of the time. That and her success. And I'll just start by discussing how she was evangelical in a way that others weren't at the time. There were other Christian writers, but there weren't so many evangelical writers. Evangelical is the term that she used herself. There were other terms that were used, less positive terms. But that just basically means that she was doing more than the cultural Christian thing. She wanted to be a biblical Christian as best as she could. So she said, I know of no way of teaching morals, but of infusing principles of Christianity, nor of teaching Christianity without a thorough knowledge of the scriptures. So she was talking in her books about morality, but she didn't want to teach morality. She wanted to teach Christianity. Christianity would lead to morality. And that is huge in setting her apart. Another quote of hers is she didn't just want Christianity. She didn't just want the average Anglican or Catholic. I mean, she wanted to do something different by saying Bible Christianity is what I love. A Christianity practical and pure, which teaches holiness, humility, repentance, and faith in Christ, and which, after summing up all the evangelical graces, declares that the greatest of these is love. She was going for something more, something deeper, something more substantial, something more eternal than the other authors were going for. And because of that, it changed her writing. Second, Hannah More, another really fascinating, this is where the bulk of my paper lay, was discussing how she adapted her writing to meet the different needs of the readers. She did this because she looked around her, and she had been with the upper classes when she was a famous literary the Blue Stocking, with the Samuel Johnson crowd, the play crowd. She was really like fancy up there. She'd also been among the poor when she'd worked in the Cheddar School, started the Sunday School movement. So she knew that there was a distinct need and a distinct way of life between these two groups, but she knew they both needed Jesus and they both needed morality. So she was going to figure out a way to write a play, to write a book, to write something that could be useful for both groups of people. And that's what she did. And the fact that she was so successful with both speaks of her amazing talent, her amazing, God's grace toward her and giving her that talent, and how successful she was. So briefly, the rich. She was living in a time when the rich were obsessed with novels. They were like the Netflix of the girls were just like flocking to novels all the time, constantly, novels. I see Northanger Abbey, or parody of Northanger Abbey there. If you've read Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey, kind of get a picture of just everyone was reading novels. So she said, well, those novels are okay, some of them aren't okay, but I can make one that's going to teach Christianity. So she responded by writing one novel in 1808, Coelebs in Search of a Wife, which I have here in this. You can tell by this awesome, really good copy that everyone's buying this book. It's like a facsimile. It's printed the day that I ordered it from Amazon. So you can get it real cheap. Just throwing that out there. And this novel is, first of all, she's brilliant by just calling it Coelebs in Search of a Wife, because she was appealing to these rich young girls who were trying to find husbands. And I mean, that's a title that's going to catch a rich young girl trying to find a husband's attention. Just saying. And the premise of the book is this guy who's like looking for a wife, right? And that's the premise. It's not actually the content of the book. The book is all about how he's like, oh, I'm going to go visit this house and meet these people and learn about Christianity from them. And then I'm going to go meet these people, learn about Christianity from them. Then we're going to have a conversation about Christianity. So it continues in this pattern. Yes, he's looking for a wife, but he's also talking a lot about Christianity. It was a very clever way, very successful way to get the gospel message as well as the don't be a hypocrite message out to these people who were living a cultural Christianity life and not living a true Christian life. And she was ridiculously successful. By today's standards, you would be amazed at, if you read this especially, how successful she was. It's really good. It's just probably not what you would expect from a best-selling novel. In the first 3 days, the first edition sold out. In 9 months, she sold 12 editions. In 1 year, she made almost 6 times as much as Jane Austen made ever off of Mansfield Park, which was her most comparable novel. They were contemporaries of each other, Austen and Moore, but Moore was so much more popular, it's not even worth mentioning Austen in the same conversation to people often. Austen had comments about Moore in her works about how she was kind of annoyed because Moore was so much more popular than she was. But, I mean, Hannah More, her Coelebs in Search of a Wife, translated into German, translated into French. By 1834, there were 30 editions in America. And by all accounts, Coelebs was the most widely read novel of the first quarter of the 19th century. And it's the gospel, guys. It's amazing that this was so widely read, and she did it phenomenally with that setup that she had as a successful author. But that's not the only thing she did. She knew that this would reach the rich, but it wouldn't reach the poor. And she wanted to get the gospel to the lower classes. So she noticed that among the lower classes, there were these little tracts, little chapbooks that were really popular, being sold for like a penny. And they often weren't so clean. She called them pernicious trash in a very strongly worded article or two. They could be kind of dirty. And so she decided, though, if she took the same format, she took the same verbiage, she took the same idea, the same pricing, or cheaper, she could do the same thing with the gospel. So she did. She wrote what's called I think I have another picture of it here. Yeah. The cheap repository tracts. She's also fairly well known for this. If you're talking about more, either abolition or cheap repository tracts would probably come up. The tracts were a series over a number of years that were being published on a monthly-ish basis, and she wrote about 80% of them. She was the chief editor. She was making sure that they were at the cheapest possible price, and they were getting to the highest need communities. They would talk about things like the gospel, but they would also talk about things like, let's talk about how we can save some pennies on your bread and help you out in a more practical sense. How can I help you get from, how can I help you clean up your housekeeping tips or how to interact with other people type of tips. Very interesting collection and selection. But again, incredibly successful. In 1 year, they sold 2 million copies, which is a lot of copies when you consider the size of the English-speaking world at the time. It broke all the best-selling records in existence. She was so popular. It went to America, went to the West Indies, went to Sierra Leone. It was translated into Russian. And then it became so popular that they took the little tracts, they bound them into expensive volumes, and sold them to the upper classes who wanted them for their children. And then they had extra spending money, which then Hannah More put right back into the project and made the tracts even cheaper so they could be given away practically to the lower classes. So Hannah More ultimately was very successful. It's difficult, very, very difficult, to try to measure the impact of one person. It's kind of impossible, I would argue. I tried to, and it was fascinating to consider the impact that she had. Even Alexander Johnstone, the Chief Justice of Ceylon in 1819, so this is even before her life was over and she hadn't even done a lot of her writings yet, said, "What a pleasure it must afford you to have the power of producing such moral improvements by your writings, not only throughout Europe, but throughout Asia also. For I'm convinced that your writings have had a greater effect and have been more generally read than any other works which have been written for the last 100 years." I would argue that he's mathematically probably not far off, because it was a best-selling novel, best-selling tracts. She was personally commissioned to write a book for 8-year-old Princess Charlotte. She wrote books from the range of poems, and even her poem Slavery I could go on and on about the many, many different works she wrote and how widely spread, widely recognized she was. And I didn't even get a chance to get into all of this, but not only did she have an impact on abolition, she was a huge factor in quelling revolution in England. That can be controversial as well, but it was an impact that she had. She, especially because Lucilla, spoiler alert, that's the wife he finds, was incredibly charitable, incredibly loving and good. Young ladies were like, I want to be like Lucilla, like the best-selling lady in the books. So it became a fashion and a rage, all sorts of cool quotes and statistics about that. And some would even argue that she helped usher in the Victorian era. Obviously not the actual queen, but the cultural sense of the Victorian era, the more Puritan, more Christian-based Victorian era, that some have argued that Hannah More's moral improvements in society were what was really causing that to happen. My last question I had to ask myself was, when do I stop? Because I really like Hannah More. So I did have some very fun opportunities. My lovely roommate, who had put up with the tent all summer, decided to throw me a Hannah More party, possibly the first in ever. Don't know. Then Dr. Garrett's, who was very good to me throughout this entire process, gave me the excellent opportunity of helping me connect with Dr. Karen Swallow-Prior, the author of this book. So I got to meet her, and then we both got to talk about Hannah More, which is very exciting for both of us. I hope, at least me. And she read my paper, and it was just really cool to be able to connect with her after the fact and hear her lecture as well.
She also just liked to tweet about you.
Oh.
She was very happy.
Oh, good. That's good to know. And ultimately, Hannah More has left me as a role model and a literary mentor, so to speak. I have her picture hanging in my room, and there's just so much you can learn from her, so much you can learn from what she wrote. This is like a devotional, let's be honest. And there's just depth and richness to it that I am just totally floored by. That if I could be anything like Hannah More in the capacity to use what I have for the glory of God, and that's what we're living for. And I'm just so awed and inspired by how perfectly Hannah More did this, and I just continue to look to her as an amazing role model. I'll leave you with a final quote from Hannah More. I have this one in my bedroom as well. It's possibly my favorite. It comes straight out of her best-selling novel. Just throwing that out there. The only infallible standard is to be in the conscientious practice of measuring all we do and say and think by the unerring rule of God's word. This is a standard Hannah More lived by, and it's a standard she wrote by, and it's the legacy she's left us with. So Hannah More is an amazing woman, and I really seek to do the best I can to tell as many people as I can about her and get as many people as I can excited about her as I am. So, thank you very much. Any questions or yes?
I was wondering, do your writings tell anything? What were Hannah More's interactions with John Wesley? They were contemporaries.
Yeah, I mean, she brushed elbows with basically everybody who was famous. So there was interaction there, not anything substantial, not like Wilberforce's connection, but she certainly was aware and they were aware of each other. Yeah. Yes?
How did you first learn about her to know the research?
Dr. Garrett's class, actually. He had mentioned her very briefly in modern Europe about the cheap repository tracts in the Victorian era. And then from there, I'm not really entirely sure how I ended up landing on her. I had a few different ideas of people that had interested me or topics that had interested me. And then I guess that this is just kind of what I ended up being led to. And I'm very thankful that I prayed about it a lot, and I think I landed on a good one. So. Yes?
What happened to her literary associations when she was converted to the evangelical point of view? She was her little club and all the people who revered her. Did that remain the case, or did some of them sort of feel like she had become too weird for them or something?
That was primarily the case, that they felt that she was no longer one of them, so to speak. Now, part of this was Hannah More, because after she became a very strong Christian, she decided that she wasn't sure what to do with herself at first. Like, should I even do this anymore? Should I even go to the theater anymore? So she actually stepped out of that world for a while, and those societies kept going without her because she was a member of them. And she left, and they were kind of annoyed, but they weren't going to stop meeting or anything. And then when she did decide that, yes, I am going to continue to be a writer, at that point she more or less kind of cut ties. She would still go back and visit them and everything, but she was living such a different life, and she had no interest in being part of. She wrote a poem, actually the poem that we get the phrase, all that glitters is not gold, came from one of her poems, and that she recognized that this world isn't going to offer me everything that I thought it was, and being part of these cool societies, it's nice, but there's also a lot of temptation there that I don't need to be part of, and I'm happier working at the Sunday schools, I'm happier working with the impoverished people. She even worked for animal cruelty for a while. That type of thing, which wasn't popular with the literary circles, and they just had less in common at that point. Oh, yes.
So this is more about the process, I guess, but kind of based on what I'm hearing, did you find that actually writing the paper for Senior Sem itself was difficult just because of how much you had learned and whittling it down to that, page limit, I guess? Was it difficult? Or
Dr. Gertz could mention the page limit. I didn't exactly follow the page
This is a
limit.
question from a Senior Sem student writing a paper for next month.
Okay. The first draft did kind of come all at once, not at once, at once. It was kind of long, so it wasn't actually at once. It was very long. Then I had to cut out half of it. But when I actually sat down to write it, yes, that part was a little easier because I knew what I was going to say. It was more like the outlining process and the 3 months leading up to the actual writing that I did in August was certainly the harder part. And then actually writing it was late nights and just getting it done, but it was kind of fun too because I knew what I was talking about and I was excited about it, so. Great. Thank you very much.